to Season 4 of the podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Blackwood. If you've never listened to my podcast before, then welcome to you, and please hit that subscribe button. It's hugely beneficial to us podcasters. As many of you know, I wrote my autobiography as a survivor of human trafficking called Custom Justice, but if you didn't know, you do now. Keeping in line with that, this entire season has been focused on interviewing other people who did or plan to write about their own experiences as trauma survivors and how they overcame their past. As much as we all hate commercials, they are a necessary evil these days. That's what keeps the show on the air. You can also show support by purchasing one of my mini books or donating through PayPal or leaving a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on. You can find the links for the books or donation options in the podcast description, of course, as well as the links to the guest. As always, a portion of the proceeds from this podcast do go to local organizations that help fight human trafficking. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. As always, I'm your host, Amanda Blackwood, and I have a very special guest with me today. This man has done so much work to be able to uncover his family's past and history in order to understand it and learn how to move beyond it. And I am so excited to have Max Friedman with me today. Max, welcome to the show, and thank you for being with me.
No, thank you for having me and allowing me to talk a little bit about what's on my mind and what's on your mind.
Your story is just incredible. I can't see anybody not wanting to have you be able to speak up and talk a little bit about it. So let's start a little bit with who you are and where you came from. Where were you born?
I was born in Sweden, which is an unlikely place for someone named Max Friedman to be born.
Yes. And you don't have a Swedish accent.
No, but when I had hair, I used to have blonde hair. As my mother used to tell me, well, therefore, you're Swedish. But unlike the rest of my family, because they all actually also had blue eyes, I have brown eyes. And my 8th grade biology teacher told me, well, you must be adopted, which actually was one of the best things I ever heard. It made my day until I found out she didn't know what she was talking about, and that's why she was teaching 8th grade biology. But anyway, so I was born in Sweden. My parents met in Sweden. They were both liberated from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp at the end of the war, and they were both in pretty bad shape. They had lost everybody. They were on their own, and Sweden took about 6,000 survivors of the camp, mostly the Jewish survivors of Bergen-Belsen. And Bergen-Belsen was a horrible, horrible place. My Anne Frank died there.
Right.
And they met there. They had my sister, they married. Many survivors married other survivors, because I think it's the only people who could begin to understand what they had been through. Right. And my sister was born in 1947. I was born in 1950. And by 1952, we emigrated to the U.S. and lived in, of all places, Coney Island. We were not allowed to go on any rides. My parents were the original helicopter parents. They refused to allow us out of their sight, and therefore we became who we became, fearful of too much. But anyway, and so we lived there for a while, and then moved to Brighton Beach, a little bit away, and I don't know, I could go on forever, but that's where we were born, and that's why we were born in Sweden.
Wow, that is amazing. And helicopter parents or not, it kind of makes sense at the same time, because it's like you said, they lost everybody.
Right.
The last thing they were willing to do is lose their children now.
Right. My father actually lost his first wife and his 2 children.
Oh.
And my mother lost her husband, lost all her brothers. She actually saved the life of her one sister, and they were together through the camps, and then even afterwards, they lived near us for a while.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
but my father lost his mother. His father had died earlier, and his sisters and a brother and everybody else. So it was just, my father was totally alone. My mother had a sister, but that's all. And
Wow.
so they had to they you know they had to start all over again. And the thing about it is that I always felt that uh, they were sad people, which they were, and that I never really saw the heroic aspects of starting all over again, and mostly until I learned more about what they had been through and had to overcome to start all over again. And then they became my heroes.
Wow. How old were you when you found out that your dad and mom had been married previously and had lost their spouses
Well,
and their families?
I knew that they had been married when we were young, because my mother used to talk about the camps on a fairly continual basis,
Mm,
and nothing else. So I think my first words out of my mouth should have been Mengele, because I heard more about Mengele than I heard about any fairy tale or any other thing.
wow.
She talked to us about Mengele. She talked about Plaszow, about Auschwitz, but she didn't talk at all about her life before the camps, except for one story that she would tell us, which turned out not to be true. Uh, my father talked nothing about his life. I didn't know anything. My mother said that he had been married before and he lost children, and that's all. But he never said it until I was 20 years old. And I was trying to get a draft deferment, and I asked him, he had to tell me something about his life. And for 20 minutes, he told me a story, which was a very sad story about the last time he saw his wife and two children. Um, but even then, he didn't say where, he didn't say when, he didn't say how. And it turned out that that story wasn't quite true either, because that when he told me that story happened, he was already in a concentration camp 300 miles away. So I
Mm.
had to reconstruct everything.
That could not have been easy. Where do you even start with doing something like that?
Uh, you start with the little things that I thought I knew. And then I was fortunate enough to have a friend. Uh, and the reason why I started really was that my mother had just died. My father had died 5 years before. And my grandson, who was 8 at the time and is now 15 and a teenager, so a whole other person. Uh, but my grandson at the time was having some sort of tough times. And it was the first time that I told him that my parents were what I called survivors. And he was intrigued by the idea of somebody being a survivor. Again, he was only 8. Uh, and he asked me, what does that mean? Does that mean that they were strong? Does that mean that you were a survivor or something, that you were strong? Was my daddy strong, my son, his father? And he said, could I be strong one day like a survivor? And I said, I really don't know. And that was in 2016. Uh, and so 2016 till now, because I still am learning things, uh, I decided to find out who they were, mostly before the war and during the war, and what happened to them during the war. And I was fortunate enough to have a friend who I happened to mention the idea to. And he said, well, I just came back from he was born in South Africa, actually. And he said, I just came back from a reunion with my high school classmates in South Africa. And one of them, it turns out, has a son who does Holocaust research. He's German. He's not Jewish at all.
Oh my gosh.
And he's in Munich. And you might want to give him a call or send him an email, and maybe he can put you on the right track. And Giles put me on hundreds of tracks. And if I went through all of that list, I'd be still doing this. But he gave me a lot of leads, a lot of places to try, a lot of memorial sites to look at. And then he gave me people who were experts. I mean, I got the world expert in death marches. I got the world expert in survivors of Bergen-Belsen. And all these people told me more. I would tell them what I knew, and they would say no, or yes, or this, how it might have been. And then, and we would eventually go. My wife and I went to Poland, went to Sweden, went to Israel. I found a niece that my father had through his first wife,
Oh, wow.
working in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Site of all places.
Oh,
And we met her in 2018. And I learned more, therefore, about his first wife and that family. So it was this piece of, it's sort of like I I once did I'm a writer, or I try to be a writer for most of my life, and uh, and I would do writing workshops sometimes, and I used as an example the things that the New York Times did after 9/11, where they went to every person who lost somebody, the family of everybody who had been killed, and they went to find out, to do a small short profile of who these people were. In these profiles, I don't know if you know, but they were collected in a book, and and I got to talk to the person who was doing a lot of the profiles, and she said what she had done is you go in and you start asking all kinds of questions, and you see which ones work and which ones don't work, and over a 20 or 30-minute period, you get to something that allows you to pull on a string, and you pull on that string, and that string is what the story is going to be about that person. That one thing that a wife or a mother or a daughter wanted to be remembered about their father or their husband or their son. And
wow.
so when I did all this, I kept pulling on strings. I kept pulling, and sometimes they were dead ends. Sometimes it turned out that the Frida Friedman, my mother's name, or one of her many names that she used, but that there was another Frida Friedman. Actually, there were two, and they were both in Auschwitz at the same time, and they
Oh,
were and they were mistaken for each other, and so. Uh, when I would get information about one Frieda Friedman, they talked about a cousin. And I said, what cousin? And I started to find out about this cousin. But then I found out that all these cousins were from Hungary. And I said, well, these are Polish people. These are not Hungarians. And so, that whole avenue went away, because suddenly I thought that, and what ended up happening is that other people believed that this was a different Frieda Friedman, and at the end of the day, I found that Frieda Friedman had died in Sweden, uh, and her husband, they said, was my mother's actual husband. So they put the wrong husband to the wrong lady. So this was a
wow.
5-year journey of getting mixed up, and then being joyful just to find something. I mean, and being saddened in ways that I never thought I could be saddened when I discovered the names of my father's children, Ada and Fagla. One was 1.5 and one was 4.
Oh,
And when I discovered their names, and I discovered actually the day that they went into the gas chambers with their mother, and I discovered that day, and their names and when they were born, and obviously when they died, uh, I felt like they were now real people, that they were my sisters, and and I cried for a very long time, and even when I even think about it, I sort of well up. And then the coup de grace of all of that was going to Auschwitz. And when you go to Auschwitz, amongst many other terrible things that they tell you, is that the crematoria where the bodies were burned, 1 million bodies were burned, more, uh, that they ran out of space for the ashes. They had nowhere to put the ashes. So what they did was they put the ashes on the ground. So when you walk on the grounds of Bergen-Belsen, I'm sorry, of Auschwitz, you are walking on possibly your family, possibly friends, possibly my mother's entire family,
Wow.
who were all murdered there. So that is another point where you can't stop crying. But you also feel a tenderness and you feel a closeness to people that you only know their names and the days they were born and the days they died.
It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is, and it redoubles whatever little bit I can do, not only to restore the humanity that was taken away from my parents and the lives that were taken away from them, but also for all the others and for what could still happen at any moment in time in
Yeah.
this country, even.
Yeah. There's nobody that is immune
That's
to
right.
horrible acts
That's right.
perpetrated by mankind.
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
And you a survivor of other kinds of horrible acts and so many people, and just knowing that, one day things are okay. And then the next day, things will never be the same again.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you find any stories in your research that were things that you enjoy passing on, or was it all
Well,
complete devastation?
well, I mean, I enjoyed the fact that my mother made up these stories and that I believed them, and my sister believed them. My sister was harmed a lot more by our survival with mostly with my mother, who I think even before the war was not all there, but after the war had checked out almost altogether. And and so my mother essentially tried to recreate her life through my sister, the
Mm,
life she never had. And so my sister couldn't be the person she wanted to be. It was the person my mother wanted to be. And that harmed her for ever, in a sense, uh, when I wrote this book. And so she wiped her memory as though it was a hard drive. She wiped it of her her childhood. She doesn't remember anything about what that book talks about when we were young,
wow.
and because it was too difficult for her. And only sort of the last year or two when my mother was alive, but mostly after she died, my sister sort of started to find herself and started to find out who she wanted to be, not who my mother wanted her to be.
Wow.
And even when I wrote the book, I sent the draft. I gave it to my wife, who was my best friend and my editor and my critic and my supporter, and I gave it to my grandson, and he was already older. And I said, "Well, you started this, so read it." And I gave it to my sister, and I told my sister that if this upsets you too much, I'll burn the manuscript, and that'll be the end of it, because you're more important than this story. And,
Oh, what a good
and
brother you are.
well, I mean, she did suffer, and she didn't. I mean, so I mean, it was sad to see. I was joyous when I learned something new, even if it was something horrible. I learned, for example, that if the war were 3 days shorter or something, or if my mother's oldest brother would have survived,
Oh,
my mother's father, indeed, would have survived, because he was one of the last to leave Plaszow when the Russians came and they did truly a death march directly to Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was right near Krakow, and Plaszow was right outside of Krakow, the concentration camp. And so, it was a sad thing to learn, but it was, it was something new. And I would tell my sister, and my sister said, "That's great." And that was about the end of her interest in it, because she just, it was still too difficult for her. And then doing the book now. So when she read the book, she said, "Oh no, no, this is wonderful." Uh, and even as I do podcasts or book talks or whatever, uh, she says that it's helping her heal. So that's great.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah,
Well, I'm very happy to hear that. It's not easy for a family to go through trauma, and I know that growing up with your family the way that things were, that wasn't an easy journey for you guys at all. And
no,
it's common for kids to be able to block out their childhood memories because it's just a coping mechanism. They
oh
don't know
yeah,
how else to deal with it.
oh yeah.
Yeah, and I love that you were able to go out and find the information that you needed to be able to write your book. Now, what's your book called?
It's called Painful Joy. Painful Joy. The title simply came from a poem that I happened on. That was a poem written in the Middle Ages by a Jewish poet and mystic, and then it was revived in some way and put in the first prayer book of the Reform Judaism movement in the 1950s. And I found it, and it's a short poem. It's in the book, and it's a poem about what happens to love when it's touched by death.
Mm.
And as soon as I saw that, I said, "This is the title of the book." I was searching for a book at the title, obviously, and this is perfect. And the best part of it was not the pain, but the joy. And the joy, for me, actually came when I discovered, because you wouldn't know it if you were living in our house with my parents, uh, that they loved each other, at least at the beginning. And I found a love letter that my father had written in Sweden to somebody who was trying to help people emigrate. And it talked about how he had just met this woman, my mother, 3 days before, and that they had fallen in love, and that she had barely survived in Bergen-Belsen, and he had lost everybody. And they were going to live together, whether they were allowed to or not, because my father was actually, or claimed to be, quite a religious Jew, and certainly when we knew him, he was. Uh, but but they would live together until they would be allowed to marry, and when once they knew for certain that their first spouses had been murdered, and they were no longer around. Uh, but but that letter, uh, which actually opens the book, was an affirmation of love, which these two people showed toward us. And certainly, my father did much more. My mother was sort of a more complicated love, uh, but to each other, very little affection, very mostly fighting and arguing. And it was in writing this book and in talking about this book even afterwards, because I've learned a lot more just from talking about it and thinking about it more, is that when they were screaming, they weren't really screaming at each other. I mean, they really were screaming at the universe.
Yeah.
They didn't know how else to deal with it. I mean, they had nightmares, they had PTSD, to say the least. Uh, but that wasn't enough of an outlet, and the outlet became each of them finding the only other person who could understand them, and yet didn't understand them enough, because they they had their own families, they had their own past, and they didn't ever share their past with the present. And so there was so much still left to not only to grieve for, but left still inside that they never really came to terms with in any sensible way. There was no one that ever offered help to them, but and they never really sought help.
Well,
in
and in
anymore.
so many ways, we didn't know how to help people that had
Yeah,
lived through something like
exactly.
this.
Yeah,
You know,
and also it was the 1950s, when they were in their fullest grieving period, when everything was so close, and where they remembered and didn't try to forget. Uh, that that was the 50s, the 60s. No
right.
one would talk about mental illness, God forbid.
Right.
Uh,
If you talk about
right?
mental illness, it means that you belong in an insane asylum, right?
Yeah. They shall take you away, and
Yeah.
my parents had been taken away enough.
Right. Right. They don't want to go
But
through this again.
no,
And
I mean, even in Sweden, they lived in a camp, in several camps. They
wow.
moved them from camp to camp. Now these were nice camps. They fed them, but
I mean, that's a step up, of course.
right. But the survivors of the camps, from what I could understand about the camps, kept their habits. So they would steal food, they would hide food. They would do what they did in the other camps.
They were
Uh,
trained.
and yeah, this is what they knew. And my my parents' entire lives were still the lives of survivors. My mother stole food still, whenever she went anywhere. She would she would line her book with her pocketbook with aluminum foil, and put food in anywhere she went.
Wow.
Uh, and but she would hide food from us. She was bulimic, actually, because of the food stuff that happened in those camps. So it was always something. It was always There was a manifestation of what happened to them all the time, and it's just a matter of when you stopped noticing, when you had seen it enough. And for my sister or me, or for my sister, she was so directly affected. I was lucky. I was lucky that I sensed something very bad was going on when I was very young. Uh, I think maybe it was. I think I write about it in the book my when the our landlord came to collect the rent, and we didn't have money, and my mother told us to get into a closet with her,
Oh,
be quiet. And it was only maybe a month or two ago. So I write it in the book as though poor Rachel, my sister, and poor Max, for having to stand in this closet, still quiet, until the banging on the door stopped, how scared we were. And it didn't occur to me really till, not that long ago, that what about my mother in that closet? What kind of terrors was she reliving
right.
herself when the soldiers came, when they banged down the door and they liquidated the ghetto, the Krakow ghetto? I mean, all that stuff. And it was only then that I said, oh, I'm thinking about myself too much. I need to go back to the root of this problem. And besides anti-Semitism and God knows what else that caused this problem, but really the people who were most affected, my parents, at least that I know.
Yeah.
And then my journey became more a journey of how do I elicit empathy for survivors, for these people, not just my parents, because I think someone who might read the book and wouldn't know them only as strangers at the beginning, but then by the time you're done, I think a lot of people are people who I know who read the book, who knew me, but not strangers in particular, but my parents were strangers to them. Uh, fell for Felt for them. They cried when I took my last walk with my mother, or when my father dies of all things of Alzheimer's. Even as he tried to wipe his own memory for his whole life, this is what happens to him, and an ironic way to end. But uh, but empathy became sort of what I hope people get out, and not just empathy for survivors or for my parents or victims, but empathy for just people who are just trying to live their lives and understand that people go through bad times, and you should at least give them the space and give them the benefit of the doubt instead of seeing them as an enemy or somebody I don't really care about.
Right. Absolutely. I agree. Do you happen to have a copy of your book handy? Would you be all right with reading a part of it for us?
Sure. Give me a second.
Okay. And while you're doing that, for people that are interested in grabbing a copy of this book, I would totally suggest that. I am going to have in the show notes the link to be able to go and grab it off of
Here I am.
Amazon. And Max's website and his LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter accounts, all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, the book is there in hardcover and Kindle edition and softcover, whatever you like. Sometimes Amazon has big sales, so you can get it for almost nothing. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, you actually can get it for nothing.
Oh,
Except,
nice.
except for your subscription to Kindle. I get about 4/10 of 1 penny every page you turn, but hopefully you'll turn at least all the pages and I'll make 50 or 60 cents on it. But anyway, I will be happy to, well, uh, sure. Is there any part in particular that you want me to read, or do you want me to just pick
Whichever
apart?
part you think would speak most to people.
Uh, let's see. Let's see. I mean, the part I mentioned. Uh, yeah. Well, here's something. Uh, there's a little part where I talk about going to see Schindler's List, the
Mm,
Spielberg film,
yes.
which I think celebrated, or I don't know, marked its 30th anniversary. It was it first came out in 1993, I think, and I was very reluctant to see it. I was very reluctant to have anything to do with the past that I had lived.
Yeah.
So, but my wife said we really should, I mean, let's see what it was. So we did. And so I'll read that. My sister and I spend our youth finding ways to make sure our parents never watched any documentaries, movies, or TV shows depicting the Holocaust. We knew precious little about their lives before we emigrated to the U.S., except that they had lost their families in the Holocaust and had been imprisoned in concentration camps. What we did know was that they relived those nightmares too often at night. The terrible dreams that made them scream in their sleep never did go away. When the movie Schindler's List came out, I was frankly hesitant to see it, but eventually, if reluctantly, joined my family and we went to the movie theater. After all, it represented a piece of my heritage, and I had read that it covered events that took place in places my mother had mentioned to us. She was still alive. Sharing in some of those memories was the least I could do. In fact, Schindler's List opened my eyes and my mind in ways I hadn't imagined. Suddenly, I saw at least a version of my mother's world when she was a young woman, and as she might have experienced it. I saw more realistically than ever before what she had faced in trying to survive. She was not a Schindler Jew saved from the extermination by Oskar Schindler, but just about everything else I saw in the film aligned with her experiences in the war. On the screen, I saw the Krakow ghetto as she might have, its establishment, its liquidation, and the monstrous commander, Amon Get, of the Plaszow concentration camp, where she and members of her family were imprisoned. I saw the train ramp at Auschwitz where the angel of death, Mengele, selected some who would live and some who would die. I saw that angel deciding the fate of my mother and aunt who survived and the fate of most of the rest of her family and my father's family who were all murdered. I didn't know then that a quarter century later I'd be sitting on the steps of Josepha 12 in Kazimierz, where my mother grew up, in Krakow, with a laptop computer, watching Schindler's List again, where it actually was filmed. It was there that my mother and her family cooked, cleaned, and lived, and it was from there that they were deported to their prisons or sent to their deaths. life is strange, very strange.
Wow.
And that the truth of it is, we were going to Krakow, because that's where Auschwitz is, and that's where Plaszow is a concentration camp, and that's where my mother lived for 25 of her 30 years before the war. And so we went there. And so I decided I didn't want to get lost in Krakow. I'll put in the address that I had for her, that I had found on a German ID card, actually, of where she lived. And it was Josepha 12, which is in the Jewish quarter of Krakow, called Kazimierz. And so we figured we'd go there, but first I wanted to Google it. So I Googled Josepha 12, Kazimierz, Krakow, and I get all kinds of stuff about Schindler's List. And it's there that I
Oh,
discover that that Spielberg shot the scenes of the Krakow ghetto, which is an important part of Schindler's List, uh, in the building my mother lived in for 25 years.
oh my God.
And when we went to that building, right as soon as we arrived in Krakow, we went to that building. Uh, Tours are given of that building because Steven Spielberg used this, and people who come to visit, or who are coming because their family lived or died, or somehow were related to Auschwitz, or whatever it was. Uh, they're given, this is on the tour, everybody's tour, and if you look at the pictures on Google or
Yeah.
anywhere, you will see this building as being the center of it, and you'll see what scenes Spielberg used and why he used this particular building, which again
Wow.
is generally described as a tenement because it
Right.
was, and now it's being sort of gentrified, and it costs $1 million to get a two-room apartment or whatever it is there. But
Oh,
it was there that it was the first time that I actually talked to a stranger, not my family, but a stranger about this. And there was a woman, a tour guide, giving a tour, and there were these people standing around her. And I went over to her, which I never had done before to anybody. I went over to her and I said, my mother lived here. She said, what? And then I gave her the very short version that I knew, because I would come to learn even more. Uh, and then I stopped talking because I was crying. Uh, but it was the first time that I sort of accepted that this building was part of my life, my past, my mother, uh, and you can say the ghosts, her ghost, my grandfather, my grandmother's ghost inhabited her first husband. They lived there too. So, so that's the long way of of Schindler's List being in my life.
that is amazing.
Yeah,
Absolutely amazing. And
yeah. Anyway,
I know that that when they made Schindler's List, they invited a lot of the survivors and their families out. It's probably one of my favorite scenes in the film is that final
right,
scene.
right at the end, right,
Oh my
right.
gosh.
Yeah,
Just I can't help it. Every time I watch the movie, I weep.
I know. No, it's yeah, and and in fact, it's weird because after this book was published, a friend of mine who works for an organization called the Claims Conference, which basically is still trying to get back property for the families of people whose property was taken, whether it's
Right.
art or simple property, like somebody who owned a drugstore or something. That building was taken by the Poles or by the Soviets, or still in somebody else owns. And so the claims conference is there to try to help people and their families. It was set up right after the war for the survivors, but then families. So she decided that she was going to try to get some publicity for the book. So the hook was property. Well, what was the only property that we could find that my mother even was associated with, which was Josepha 12. So I don't know, I wrote a little story about it. And so it appeared in all the Israeli newspapers, at least.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and in the UK, there's a big Jewish newspaper. And the story of my mother and all I ever say to people is, and when they ask about what would my mother think about all this stuff, my mother wanted to always be the center of attention, which is what she tried to get my sister to become. And my sister did not want to be the center of attention at all. So my mother, they died, my parents both died in Mobile, Alabama, of all places, because my sister lived there, of all places. Uh, so, so my mother would wear the badge of being a concentration camp survivor on her sleeve, as though it were the Star of David, being, being forced to wear. And she would tell anybody that she met on the street, the mailmen, the strangers, she would just come up to them and she said, "I was in Auschwitz."
Wow.
And when in sort of a broken English, her English was never very good, but it was good enough. And and she became sort of a little celebrity on Holocaust Memorial Day. They would she because she was there for 5 years, the last 5 years of her life, and there would be a TV interview with her because how many survivors were in Mobile, Alabama, uh, or there would be a story in the newspaper. And in fact, when she died, her story was reprised on the front page of the Mobile Register, the daily paper, uh, that she had just died. And my mother would have loved the attention, because that's I think that's all she really wanted in life was attention, and
Wow.
not the kind she got, the kind she thought she should get.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Man, what a cool lady. I mean, I
Yeah,
know she.
yeah, yeah. I mean, both of them were, they were character. Especially my mother. My mother, you would never forget my mother. My mother would tell you the truth about everything. What she believed, she had no filters. No filters. We knew a woman who was very nice to my parents when they moved to Mobile, who was also had a very serious weight problem. I think she weighed about, I would say 300. Now they're on all these reality shows, but she weighed around 300 pounds at least. And she was lovely to she was a friend of my sister's, and she did a special lunch for my mother when she arrived. And my mother sat down next to her and she gives her a look and she says, "You are the fattest person I've ever seen in my life. What's wrong with you?" This is what she does. So,
Wow. Talk about no
but
filters.
but Elaine, this nice lady forgave her. I mean, people forgave her. I
Yeah.
don't know if my sister ever fully forgave her, but I think she understood her much better actually from the book, because you get to understand that these people, their whole lives, man, both my parents, they were very poor. They had many brothers and sisters. My mother had 13. Only 7 of them survived to be killed, but only 7 of them survived. The others died of various illnesses or in childbirth, but there were 13 kids. And
Oh
her
my
father
gosh.
was this poor tailor, and that was it. Uh, so,
Wow.
and my mother and her family during World War I had to escape the fighting between the Russians and the Turks and the British, which was happening. My mother lived in a little village on the border of Ukraine, and there was a lot of fighting going on, and they became refugees. So starting from the time she was 4 till the time she was 9, she lived on the streets of Prague.
Oh my
There,
gosh.
there were no settlement houses. There were no big camps. I mean, the thousands of people, thousands of Jews and Poles as well, went because Prague and Vienna were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled that part of Poland at the time. So they went there just to be sheltered or to be safer from what would have happened, might have happened to them if they had stayed. And so living on the streets, living as a refugee for 5 years, and then, you know, enduring what happened during the war, and then coming here as a refugee again.
Right.
You can begin to understand. And it was only when I learned about the first time that she was a refugee that I began to understand how the second time was too much.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, when you grow up in that kind of an environment where you're constantly on the run and thinking your life is could end at any second, you do develop this completely different way of functioning throughout life. She probably, I imagine, felt invisible for most of her life because of what she went through at such a young age. That's why she needed to be the center of
Oh,
attention.
yeah. I mean, lots of reasons, but that was
Yeah.
one of them. And the other
Yeah.
reason was that she was surrounded by a lot of boys. And
Mm.
and and Jewish women in those days were not prized as, they weren't expected to work. They probably couldn't get jobs anyway. So they were less important in the family, and it was important to get them married off. It was important to have one less mouth to feed. It was important that they find somebody who could support them and start another family and, carry the name on and all the other stuff that goes on. And so I think that was part of it. And her sister was an older sister, so her sister was given more responsibility. So in fact, she was sort of the, she was really invisible in that family, I think. And that's why I think one of the reasons why she never ever spoke. She would talk about her mother sometimes. She called her mother like an angel. And her mother would come to her at various points during her time in the camps in her dreams, because her mother was, I believe, shot on the streets of Krakow when they were liquidating the ghetto because she was too old to work in the labor camps, so she was just killed. So my mother would talk to her in at night and would talk to us about how her mother came to her in this dream and in that dream, and this is what she told her, and this is how she saved her in Bergen-Belsen by feeding her food during the night so she was never hungry. Because in fact, she said that the Germans at the end were trying to poison the prisoners. They were trying to get rid of the evidence of what they had done. So you could see how she formed into the person that she formed into.
Yeah.
And that was very important for me because, again, it was important not to see people in a one-dimensional way. Oh, she's a survivor. Oh, isn't that sad? And to see them as full human beings. I mean, my father had a wife, had two children. I mean, he was starting to live, and
Wow.
then it all turned around.
And it's an incredible story of them, being able to survive, and whether it was 100% healthy or not, they did learn how to have a life after that. They got married, they had kids, they raised their children, they've got grandkids, they've got great grandkids, and their legacy is going to live on.
Right, right, exactly, and also, and I think uh, if if I didn't write this, maybe another relative would have, but the whole idea of understanding what their journey was, so that it isn't just about that they survived. It's about who they were before and
Yeah.
who they might have become. I sort of have this little fantasy in my head that, and I did write a few pages that my publisher said, leave it alone. But my fantasy was to write a fictional version of what happened if there had not been a Holocaust. What would what would their lives have been with their first families instead of their second families?
Yeah.
And so it was a little fantasy because I wanted to have what would turn out to be a happy ending for their lives.
Yeah.
So I created a happy ending for their lives in this, and my publisher said, "Well, it's enough to just get through this. we don't need fiction at this point."
But it might be fun to kind of explore that at another time.
Yeah, another time.
Yeah. So there's always one last question that I ask my people, Max, whenever I have them on the show.
Sure.
But I'm going to modify that for you. Normally the question is, what's one thing that you love about yourself that's not related to your physical appearance? And I'm going to change that today for the first time.
Okay.
And instead it's going to be, what's one thing that you've learned to love about your family?
I've learned to love about the idea that, well, I guess that there were role models that I thought were not the role models that I wanted in my life, and that when my grandson asked about my parents as survivors, I was using survivor in a very uninformed way. And what I learned from the journey that I've taken is that they were full human beings, and that they left a legacy for us of not only not giving up, but of showing a kind of resilience and a kind of hope that in the face of what has to be the most hopeless situation. I'm sure there are other similar situations, but situations that are clearly hopeless. That there can still be a reason to live. There can still be a reason to go on, and that's a lesson I think we all need to understand, and that's what I got out of it, and and that was the most important thing for me, and I think it's the most important thing certainly for my family, and I think for others.
Absolutely fantastic. Painful Joy, a Holocaust family memoir. You can't miss it if you see it on Amazon. Bright yellow with this beautiful historic photo of, I'm assuming, your mother and father riding on a motorcycle. And
Can you imagine that?
Right. Post World War II, of course.
Yeah, post World War II, hanging out in Sweden, right? But they both had their best clothes on.
That's adorable. I love it.
Right.
That's a great photo. I love that you used that one for the cover of the book.
Yeah.
Max, thank you so much for spending your time with me today and for sharing your story. I could probably sit and talk to you for hours on end and feel like I've never had enough. Your story is amazing. Their story is amazing. I'm actually ordering a copy of your book right now. And I can't wait to read it. It's going to sit right next to my Simon Wiesenthal books.
Yeah, but I think at the end of it, I hope people come out of it with, there's a lot of pain in there, but there's also the possibility of joy, which we forget about too much, and particularly these days, God only knows. But these days, there were worse days than these days. There were, and there could be worse days still to come, but we have to cherish what we have.
For those of you who aren't aware, Holocaust Memorial Day, also known as Yom HaShoah of 2024, begins at sundown on Sunday, the 5th of May, and ends at nightfall on Monday, the 6th of May. This is the Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day. It's only a couple of days away. Thank you for listening to this podcast today. And please take a moment to think about the 6 million Jews we lost during World War II and the countless others who died fighting in that war. Thank you. If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, please make sure you check out the episode description. There you'll find links on how you can learn more about this guest, links to connect with them on social media, and how to support the podcast. Remember, I don't get paid to do this. My boss is a bit tight-fisted. I can say that. I work for myself. In short, this show really is all about the guest. If you've enjoyed their interview, please feel free to let them know. You can also tune in to my other podcast, Growth from Darkness, which is co-hosted by a lovely lady from Australia. We talk about what trauma responses are and healthy ways to move beyond the past. For more information, just go to growthfromdarkness.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/growthfromdarkness.